Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to create a serverless workflow using Amazon Step Functions. We are going to be using DynamoDB and Lambda in this demonstration. I'm also going to talk you through all the settings and all the steps along the way and show you how this is done from beginning to end. So let's get into it. All right, everyone. So here we are in the AWS console. Now, the first thing I want to do here is just show you what the input object looks like that we're going to be passing into our step functions, because that's going to dictate kind of how the flow of control works within the step function. So this is the JSON object that we are going to be using here. It's just kind of simulating a order entry. So you can see it's got an order ID, it's a string, we've got a customer ID and some other fields here. You don't really need to care about these three fields. Primarily, we're going to be working with these two here. And so the idea of what we're trying to do is we want to first save that order into a DynamoDB table. And then we want to trigger a Lambda function, which is going to call a third-party dependency. And if that call to that Lambda function fails, we want to clean ourselves up. So we want to delete that item from DynamoDB. So that's the general idea. Now, I did go through the liberty of pre-creating a DynamoDB table here. So here it is. It's just called a customer orders table. And it has a partition key, which is the customer ID, and a sort key, which is the order ID. You can see it here. Yeah, there's the partition and the sort key. We're going to be using this to store our data in this example. And in addition, I have a Lambda function that I created. It's just called test. And this doesn't really do anything. And I did this on purpose. It's just there to kind of simulate us calling a dependency. Right now, it just returns a 200 OK, but we're going to simulate this failing in our step function workflow. And I'm going to show you how the behavior changes, and we're going to take a different path of behavior in the case of failure, where we'll need to delete the item from DynamoDB. So that's the idea of what we're trying to do. So let's go into the console now, and we're going to go into the step function section of the console. You can either click it here if it's recently visited, or you can search for it up here. Just type in step functions and click on step functions here. All right, so what we want to do now is go to create state machine over here on the right. And this is going to launch the wizard that we're going to be running through. So if this is your first time using step functions, there's quite a bit of things to digest. It's kind of a pretty complicated service, but I'm going to do my best to explain it to you. So you have a couple options here to create your workflow. You can either design it visually, which we are going to do in this demonstration. By the way, like I always tell people, it's great to start with doing this stuff in the console to get a feel for how things work before moving into doing stuff in code like CDK and stuff like that. So that's one option, which we were going to use. The other is if you want to write your workflow in code, and there's a language called Amazon States language where you can kind of define your step function and the steps that it's going to take directly in code. So if you're using something like CDK or CloudFormation, which are infrastructure as code solutions, then this would be a great option for you. And then as well, there's just a kind of a thing here to run a sample project, which is just going to pre-populate some of the settings for you. But again, we want to stick with the first one here, which is design your workflow visually. Now, in addition, you have a choice of types of workflows that you want to create, or types of step functions that you want to create. There's the standard type and the express type. Previously, the only option you had was the standard type, but as of, I want to say like a year ago or so, they introduced this express type, which supports higher throughput workflows, so you can do a lot more at once. And they're more meant for kind of shorter lived workflows, whereas standard are for more longer duration. I actually have a video on this, and so you can watch that video, or you can click on the help decide button. You can see some of the differences. So a quick glance, maximum duration 1 year versus 5 minutes. So that could be a deal breaker for some of you. Some of the other differences are in terms of scale. So, this only supports 2,000 per second. This is quite a bit. So those are some of the differences between these two things. But again, watch that video if you want to learn more. All right, so what we want to do now is just go ahead and click on the next button here. And this is the workflow studio that we are going to be using to create our workflow. And this thing is really, really neat. It gives you all the different actions over here on the side. So there's a ton of different services that you can use here. We're only going to be using a very small subset of these. So these are the service integrations that are offered. And in addition, there's things called flow controls. So if you want to add things like if-else logic, if you want to do things in parallel, if you want to do things like a for each loop, or if you just want to create like a placeholder or a wait task, then all of those are supported as well. They're very useful when constructing the flow in your state machine. Okay, so what do we want to do as our first step? So our first step is just to do a DynamoDB PutItem. We want to take the input, we want to take the order ID and the customer ID and attempt to insert it into DynamoDB. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. Like you can put a Lambda function in here, and then within your Lambda function, you can like write, PutItem into DynamoDB. That's totally fine, that works. If you want to do stuff like custom logic to kind of maybe parse the input and add a timestamp for the date and do some other things, then Lambda is a great choice. But for us, we just want to take that input in kind of a raw format and just dump that into DynamoDB. So I'm just gonna, actually you can press delete. And so let's go to the search box here and just type in PutItem, and we should see, so DynamoDB PutItem. So when you drag this in and you have this different state selected, it's going to give you all these options here on the right. And let me actually zoom out a little bit so that we can see a bit more and close this feedback button. All right, so let's drag that out too. Okay, cool. So there's a couple different tabs here. So there's the configuration tab, which is going to define just generally like what is the table you want to hook this up to, what's the primary key, what's the sort key, that kind of stuff. Then there's the input. So if you want to do any filtering on the input, or maybe you only want to select a couple fields from the input, you can do that here. And then in the output section, you can do different things with the output as well. So you can transform the result that gets sent back to you from DynamoDB. You can add the original input to the result, or you can filter the output with what's called the output path. Now for us, we're going to be using a combination of these things, but I want to come back to this later and kind of show you the flow first. So first, let's go to configuration, and we need to scroll down here and look at this section here that has the table name and the column and the type here. So this is where we're going to define what table we want to write to in this case. So the table, in my case, the name is just called the customer orders table. And what we want to do now is we want to pull the order ID and the customer ID out of our input object that's going to come from kind of the first step here. And we want to write that into our DynamoDB table. So the first thing that we need to do is under column, we want to change this to the field that we want to update. So in our case, we want this to be customer ID. So we want to update the customer ID. And then this is just telling us that it's a string type. Now there's a special notation that you need to use if you want to reference an object that's coming from your input, which is kind of being passed into the step function. So what you need to do is you need to do whatever your type is, S in this case, $. You're going to be seeing this like $$ stuff a lot. This is the notation that step functions use that allow you to kind of select from input and outputs. And then for the value, if you just left this as is, you would literally store the value myEntry as your customer ID. Obviously, we don't want that. We want whatever customer ID is inside that object. So in order to do that, we're just going to back out of that and say $. Whatever the key of that incoming object is. So in our case, it's customer ID. Now, if you had like kind of a nested structure, so maybe you had something like, I don't know, like a customer object first in your JSON and then the customer ID, you would just do it when separated with dots. So customer is the key, and then within customer is the customer ID. So that's how that would work. But in our case, it's all at the top level of the JSON object, so we don't need to worry about any of that. We can just use $.customer ID. Okay, so now we want to do the same thing for the order ID because we want to store that as well. So let's just repeat that, and we're going to say order ID here, colon, and then JSON object. And we're going to do the same thing. So s.pound and then $, in quotes, $.order ID. Okay, and that should be good for that. All right, so at this point, we can basically test this out. If we save this function, then this should all work. But this is going to kind of be an iterative demonstration here where I walk you through the actual process. And this is typically how I develop as well. Like I'll do something like this, save it all, make sure it's all working, then proceed to the next step. But I want to kind of save us some pain here. And I want to just do something really quick that may kind of look a little bit odd, which is I want to drop in a Lambda function into this workflow. And I'm not going to do anything with this right now. And the reason I'm doing this is, well, we're going to use a Lambda function later for this demonstration. But the reason I'm doing this is because Step Functions has this really cool feature where whatever services that you put into your visual editor here, if you go and save your workflow now, it's going to automatically create an IAM role that has all of the permissions to do whatever you're trying to do. So for example, like I have DynamoDB PutItem and Lambda Invoke here. Step Functions needs the permissions, the IAM permissions, to call these APIs. So by putting this stuff in here during the creation process, Step Functions is automatically going to create a role that gives you access to this. If I didn't do this, so like say I deleted this thing and went ahead and created our step functions, this would work for now, but later when I added Lambda function invoke, I would need to go into the IAM role that step function created and add the permission for AWS Lambda Invoke. So I'm just kind of doing this right now just to save me some pain later. And I'll show you exactly what I mean here. So, okay, we're good here. We're going to go to next right now. And what is this saying? Okay, so it's asking us to pick a function name. Fine, we can do that. The one that I'm going to be using is just called like test or something. Oh God, there's like a million. Test : there it is. So latest. Okay, so now if we click on next up here, this should work. And this is the ASL language that I was talking to you about earlier. You can put this in CDK code if you want and upload this, but this is how you would do it if you wanted to create it programmatically. It's just like a JSON object / code representation of what we are trying to do. So yeah, that's fine. We can just click on next in the bottom here. And now, so it's asking you for a name of your state machine. Let's just call this like the customer order flow. That's good for me. We're going to say create a new role, login. You can put this to on if you want comprehensive login in CloudWatch, but you don't really need it because you get great login as a result of just using step functions in the first place. X-ray tracing. This is if you want more granular metrics on all your dependency integrations, but yeah, don't need it for this. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. So an execution role will be created with full permissions. A new execution role named blah, blah, blah will be created. All required permissions for the actions specified in your state machine will be auto-generated. Super, super cool feature. So if you click on this, it's going to tell you what it is going to create a role with what permissions. So you can see here, this first one, allow AWS Step Functions to invoke Lambda and allow AWS Step Functions to perform DynamoDB actions. And if you look here, these are the least privilege kind of permissions that are required to perform that function. If I didn't do that Lambda thing in the beginning, I'd have to come back here later and modify that role and just put myself through a lot of pain that is unnecessary. But yeah, just kind of wanted to explain how this works. All right, so I'm going to go and click on Create State Machine now. And this may take a moment or so. Actually, that was pretty quick. And we can actually start an execution now. So I'm just going to grab my input payload on my other screen here that had like the customer ID and the order ID and everything in it. Let's go to start execution. You can give it a ID here. This is just a UUID, but let's just paste in our input. So order ID, customer ID. Again, you don't need these three other things. I just put them in here for completion's sake. And we're going to go to start execution. So the first step should succeed. The second one may succeed. I can't remember what I have in that Lambda function. But this is kind of what the result view, I want to say, of the step function looks like. So you can see here in our input object, we successfully put the item into DynamoDB. And over on the right-hand side here, it gives you some really cool details of what it did. So the input to this object was, the start of the step function. So what I just pasted. And here is the output. So you can see it's a pretty comprehensive kind of HTTP response object. And I want you to pay attention to a certain field here because we're going to be using this field, which is the HTTP status code here, which is a 200. Because later I'm going to add kind of some branching logic into this step function that says if this status code is 200, we want to proceed to the next step, which is to kind of call that Lambda function, that dependency Lambda function, to maybe charge the credit card or charge the customer or whatever. And if it's not, then we want to fail our step function. So pay attention to that and also pay attention to where it's located. It's within this kind of complicated object here. But don't worry, we're going to deal with that a little bit later on. And then you can kind of see what it was doing down below as well. So for those of you that are familiar with Simple Workflow Service, so AWS SWF, sometimes it is called, this should look very familiar. So you can see here the execution starts, the first task, the state is entered, it's scheduled to be run, it's started, it's completed. You can see timelines of everything here. So this is like why I love step functions so much. You get so much data about what is happening in your workflow, and you can see like all the stuff that happens in between, and it's very, very easy to debug. But anyways, that's enough of my spiel on why I love step functions. But you can see as well that we invoked that Lambda here. It didn't do anything, but that's fine. So green is good here, as you can imagine. So success. If there's an error that gets caught and handled, it'll be orange. If it's red, if it's failed, it'll be red. And if this thing's actually live, so as you invoke stuff, you'll be able to see the statuses change. So if you have like a long running step function, then you can come here and kind of monitor what is happening and what step it's on. And then, I don't know, do whatever you want, keep an eye on it or whatever. But anyways, that's the idea with this. So let's get back to building this thing out. So I'm going to go to Edit State Machine now. And we're going to go to Workflow Studio here on the right. And we are just going to delete this guy because we don't need it until a little bit later on. So I just want to get rid of it. All right. So before we add that choice state, which is going to allow us to take two different directions here. One is the success case and one is the failure case. We need to do something with our output. We need to give the next state in our step function like the fact that this succeeded or this failed. Because if it succeeded, we want to take one path. If it failed, we want to take another path. And by default, you get that massive object that we saw, which the status code and all those different details of the HTTP request. We want to trim some of that stuff out. And in addition, we also want to pass the original input that came as part of our step function. Because when we hit our Lambda function over here in the success case, we're going to want to know what the customer ID is, what the order ID is, what the amount is, stuff like that. And by default, like that output is not passed in automatically. You need to actually specify that. So that's what we need to do here. So what we need to do now is go to the output section. By the way, with this selected, you have to have it clicked. Going to the output section, this is where we get to do some things with how the output is passed to the next state. So we're going to do a couple things here. We're going to use this one, and this is, by the way, a multi-select, so you can do more than one here. We're going to actually be using the top two. So we're going to be using the transform result with the result selector. And the reason that I want to do this is because I want to extract that HTTP status code out of the object, and I just want to have it in like a key that says status code and a value that says 200, okay, or whatever the value is. If it's 200, great. If it's not, then we'll put whatever number is in there. So I'm going to click on this, and okay, this is just giving you kind of a sample of what the input looks like, and that's totally fine. But what I want to do is, can I erase this? Okay, there we go. So it's just placeholder text. It wasn't very clear. Okay, so what we want to do is I'm going to create a new key that I want to pass to my output object. So we're going to say this is status code. This is the key that I want to use in the output of this task. And don't worry if this doesn't make sense yet, it will when I kind of invoke this next and show you what the output looks like. Okay, so we're gonna say status code. And because we want to extract, like use a value from the output JSON object, you have to use this special notation, which is .pound again. And then we're gonna say colon, and this is where we need to give the path to the status code value. I actually copied it so that we don't need to type it in here. So that's just on the side of my screen here. So this is what the JSON path is. So the first level is inside the key here, SDK HTTP metadata, and then it's also within the status code. Let me actually pull over here the actual object so you can see what I'm talking about side by side. Okay. Is this going to work? Okay, cool. So yeah, so you see SDK HTTP metadata, and then within this, so like at this level, if we scroll down, you see HTTP status code, which is a number type. This is going to matter actually. It's not a string, it's a number. This kind of bit me before, but just so you know. And then we have, HTTP status code here, and then HTTP status code here. So this is working or should work correctly. And then another thing that we want to do is, in addition to just passing the result down to the next step, we also want to include the original input to the next step as well. So the customer ID and the order ID as well. So this second multi-select box here is going to be useful for that. So add original input to the output using the result path. So that's perfect for us. That's exactly what we want to do. You can also filter it as well, but I'm not going to use that in this case. So I'm going to say, okay, let's click on that. And so, yeah, we want to combine. You can do like the combination or discard if you want to remove certain things, but let's just say combine here. In this box here, I'm just going to put $.result. And what this is effectively going to do is, and let me just get my VS Code back. So here it is. So what it's going to do is it's going to add another entry up here, and we're going to have result here. And then it's going to say within here, we're going to have the status code and whatever the status code is. And we're also going to get everything here that's moving on to the next state. So we're going to have status code and then, 200 or whatever that value is. So by doing these two things here, we're going to make sure that this is passed along with the output to the next step. And we're going to extract the status code out of the DynamoDB output and add it to our JSON object. So that's the general idea of what's going on here. Okay, so at this point, we're pretty much good to go. We can test this out actually. Like I see no reason in not doing that. So let's just try this out really quick. So apply, save. Yeah, we want to save anyways. Start execution. Can I just do I still have this pasted from before? Nah, I don't. Okay. Let me grab that again. And actually, I just want to put this to the side here so I don't confuse everyone. And we are going to put the entire object in, excluding that other stuff. Okay, so yeah, that looks good. And we have an invalid JSON. We have a comma there. Of course we do. Let's start execution now so we can see, yeah, we put the item into DynamoDB. Let's see what the output is. And now you can see what I'm talking about here. So we get that whole object back, we get the result, and we get the status code. And if we go into DynamoDB, this thing, explore table items, hello, should work. Yeah, so we have that here. I'm just going to delete this now so that we don't have an error later on. Right, so let's go back now and introduce that branching logic. We want to, depending on what the success code here, if it's a success or not, we want to take two different actions. So let's make those modifications. I'm going to scroll to the top, edit state machine. We're going to go into the studio editor. Okay, and so now, actually, you know what? Let me just rename this guy really quick. This is a really bad name. So I don't know, what did I say before? Add order entry. Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, cool. So now we want to add a flow control here, right? We want to add two different states that we can move to. So we're going to go to flow on the top left over here, and we're going to add a choice. And we're just going to drag that, and you can see like that blue horizontal line here, that kind of tells you where valid spots are. So you can add one prior if you want to kind of do something based on the input. But right now we want to do it based on the output. So you can see here that it's giving you two different options here. So what I want to do is I want this first option to be for our Lambda function. I want to invoke our Lambda function when the success of that incoming object is 200. Okay, so that's what I want to do. So let's go and grab a Lambda function here. So Lambda Invoke, okay. And now we need to do a couple things. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tell it like which Lambda function do we want to invoke here. So let's do that first since it's easy. So actually I want to rename this. So call, I don't know, credit card service to charge customer, whatever this can be. And for function name, I think I called it like test or something, right? Test. Wow, it's bad. Okay. API parameters, that's fine. We can use the state input as payload. So we're going to pass in whatever was passed in here as input, which is handy as well. Obviously, you want to know the customer ID and the order ID and all that stuff and the amount. And so what we need to do now is you can see like by default, the rule is just like there's no logic here. So what we need to do is we need to change the rule matching criteria to look at that status code to only take this path when the result is 200 okay. So let's do that now. And so we're going to click on the choice here. And where it says rules, so you can add multiple rules, by the way. You can add like, I don't know what the limit is, but it can be a lot. And so we just want to have a first rule, which is the 200, and anything else, if there's any other type of error, we want to take a different path here. So let's change this first one. So we're going to add a condition here. And so what this allows you to do is like, you can do some pretty complex things here. So like you can do one statement, you can do multiple statements that are ANDed together. You can do OR statements. So like the amount of Boolean logic is basically up to you. You can also do the inverse as well. And so what we need to do here is we don't want not, but we need to select the variable that we want to look at. So in our case, it was within the JSON object. And so the first level was result, and then the second level was status code. And so, and we want to say here, what do we want here? Is equal to. You can do matches string as well, but if it's a number type, that won't work. So you need to say is equal to. And then the type, so it's a number constant. And if it's a 200 in our case, then that's going to be our rule. So we want to go ahead now and click on Save Conditions here. And now you can see as an update, the result status code is equal to 200 is the criteria for taking this path. And then this is the other path here, so the default case. So what happens now if you get anything else other than 200? Well, right now we have an empty state, so nothing will happen. And I think this thing won't even compile properly, so it'll probably give me an error when I try to save it. But what do we actually want to happen if this fails? Well, this is the first step of the step function. You see what I did there? So we don't care if this fails, right? Like we can just fail the whole workflow and we're done. So that's exactly what I want to do here. I want to add a fail state to basically tell step functions that if you do anything other than 200 here, we're done and we need to, I don't know, do something, raise an alarm, tell the operator to come and fix this thing. Anyways, let's do that. So we want to search for fail now on the top here. And you can see here, this task is interesting. It stops and marks the step function as failure. So it's basically a hard stop for the step function, no matter where you place this fail event, step, whatever you want to call it. So we can just drag that in here now. And so now we have this failure thing, right? So we have this error handling in a way which will abort our step function. So far, this is looking pretty good. So now what is the next thing that we want to do? Say now we're in the world of our Lambda function, right? So we saved our entry into our database. Okay, cool. We succeeded. Okay, cool. And now we invoke our Lambda function. And it has two possibilities, right? It can either succeed, which is great, like we're basically done with this workflow, or it could fail. And what happens if it fails? If it fails, we need to remove that item from our database. We need to remove that order that we just created because we weren't able to go all the way with it. So this is kind of like a self-recovering workflow, which will automatically help itself recover in the case of encountering these kinds of failures. So let's do the happy case first. Let's do the success case first. And so what I want to do now is with the Lambda function selected, if you go to next state, when it's next state here, this is always in the case of success. So we're going to go to add a new state. And you can see now you can drop a state in here. Okay, awesome. So similarly to fail, we have the inverse, which is the success. So type in success and drop that in here. Okay, cool. So now if we take this path and it's success, then great. Then we are basically done and the step function is completed and we've done everything correctly. Perfect. But what happens now if this fails? We need to handle that, right? So let's do that now. So the way that we can do that, and by the way, Lambda functions are super, super cool with step functions. You can do all sorts of interesting like retry behavior and error handling. I'll go on forever about that, but let's just keep it to the script here. What I want to draw your attention to is in this menu box or this tab over here called error handling. And what this thing allows you to do, okay, here's the retryer if you want to add like retry behavior, like do this 3 times before failing. I'm not going to do that there because it'll mess up this demonstration. But what's really cool and what I do want to show you is this catch errors thing. So what does this say? Catch and revert to a fallback state when an error occurs. You can specify one or more catch rules called catchers. Okay, so let's add a catcher here, right? Because that's exactly what we want to do. If this fails, we want to catch the error and delete the entry. So let's add a catcher. And comment, we don't need that for now. Errors, so this is where you can select the type of errors. So I'm gonna actually select all here because I wanna keep it simple. But there's a whole type of different errors that you can select from. I believe you can even throw custom errors from your Lambda function and then like react to it here in your step function definition. But I haven't done that before, but I've heard that it's possible. But anyways, what we're gonna do here, like you can see some samples, if there's a timeout, if the task failed, if there's like a path issue, whatever, you can fail for a whole bunch of reasons. But I wanna fail in any case. If for whatever reason that we fail, I want to do something else. I wanna move to the fallback state. So what is the fallback state? Okay, our fallback state here in this case, well, we don't have one yet, right? We have an add order entry, but now I want to do, we did put item here, but I want to do delete item. We don't have an entry for that yet. So I'm going to go ahead and click on add a new state here. And so this is the catch flow now. So we can drop in a delete item request right here. So let's do that. So let's search for delete item, and there you go. And let's drop that in. Okay, cool. So we need to do basically the same thing that we did over here with the API parameters. We need to do the same thing over here. But this time, instead of putting it, we're just deleting it. So it turns out that it doesn't really matter. You can just copy and paste literally what I have over here from the put item into the delete item. And since it takes the same parameters like customer ID and order ID, then this will all work. So that's really all I kind of need to do here. So let's go here. And we want to just drop in that stuff. Cool. And then another thing that I wanted to do is you can either go to the end here, and if you do, it'll mark like this whole thing as successful. But in this case, you weren't really successful, right? Like the step function failed. You never completed the order. So I actually want to go to the fail state after I delete the item. And this is a little bit subjective, like there's arguments for being a success or a failure for this case, but in my case, I want it to be fail. So this is kind of what we started with when I first started the presentation, showed you the demo here. And let's just rename this thing, by the way, too. So fallback deletes failed order. Okay, that sounds good. And this should all be good to go now. I don't think I need to do anything for output here. So let's just kind of give this a whirl and see what happens. So yeah, apply and exit, I guess. Oh, by the way, definition. If you go to the definition section here, it's going to show you kind of the whole thing in the ASL language. But I'm not worried about that in this case. So let's go to apply and exit. Okay, what do we have here? So fallback, deletes, failed order, specify key. So something is wrong here. Let's fix this. This is cool too. It gives you kind of warnings if there's an error. So what did I do wrong here? Okay. Let's go back to form, specify key. I think I know why. Okay, so for the delete item API, instead of item, you have to put key. I'm pretty sure that's the problem. So let's try that. Okay, cool, that worked. And by the way, like here's the ASL. I'm gonna make this ASL available to you. So I'll put this in a comment or a description section below in like a gist or something like that. So you can have this as like an example. So don't worry about like writing this, like it would be absurd copying this out. But anyways, I will make that available to you in the description section. All right, so let's save this now. And okay, so this is a cool error. So the changes to your state machine may affect which resources it needs to access. To ensure your state machine has the right permissions, you might need to edit the current IAM role, create a new one, or select a different role. So this is basically telling us that if you added something to your step function after you added a new service integration like AWS Glue or S3 or something like that, after you created it, you're not going to have permission by default. So that's why I did the thing in the beginning to add the Lambda function during the creation step. Even though I wasn't going to use it, it just saved me a headache of having to go into like S3 go into IAM and fix this stuff. So let's go to save. And okay, state machine was successfully updated. I just want to copy that input object again from off screen so that I have it ready to go. Copy, perfect. And let's test this thing out. So let's go back to state machines, customer order flow, and start execution. Let's paste in my thingy here. Yeah, so that's the input. Let's just make sure I don't have anything in this Dynamo table. Okay, everything's cool. And as a reminder, the Lambda function just returns a 200 OK. So this is going to succeed. So let's try this thing out now. Okay, so step functions, start execution. Okay, what did I do again? Oh man, I am blind. Okay, so I have this extra comma here, and I should just get rid of that. Let me copy that so I have it at clipboard. Okay, cool. So this should work now. Yes. Okay, nice. Okay, so you see how this is blue here? So this is kind of doing its thing. And there you go. So this just worked right in front of your eyes. So blue meant that it was processing, and green means it was a success. So you can see here, like this is all working as you would expect, right? So, you get the input here. This is the input. We transformed the input for the put item. And when we went to the choice, the input was that with the status code. And then we called this guy. And here's the result, the output from our Lambda function, which was a 200 OK. And then as a result, it was a success. So let's change this now. Let's go and raise an exception in our Lambda function and then try this again. And I'll show you what that failure scenario will look like. But before I do that, let's go look at our thing here. Yeah, so we have the entry in. So let's go change our Lambda function. I just want to, raise an exception. And let's click on deploy here. Make sure you click on that or else this will not save. Okay, we successfully updated. Perfect. So now let's go back to step function again, and I want to do a new execution, and I'm going to change the value here, change it to 101. Okay, and what I'm going to do is as soon as I click this, I'm going to try and go to DynamoDB and click on run or whatever to make sure to see if there's a value there for 101, because in the fallback case, it's going to delete it, right? So I want to see if I can catch it. So, okay, start execution, go. There it is. Okay, order ID 101. And look, it's still going, right? It's still, oh, something failed. Okay, perfect. That's not an accident. It happened on purpose, right? Because we raised that exception. If you click on this, you can see what the error was. So an error occurred while executing the state, fallback, delete failed order, blah, 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 blah. All right, guys, so I figured out what went wrong here. So for this step, like we got to this step, right? And we failed, like we threw an exception. The problem was when we got to the next step, I didn't correctly pipe the output of the input object to this step here. So it was unable to read like the customer ID and the order ID that we need to delete that item from Dynamo. So I'll show you how I figured that out. You can see here in the state here. So we failed to call the credit card to charge the customer. That's fine. And then we entered the fallback state, which is to delete the failed order. So task state entered. And you can see like what happened here. And then if you look here, execution failed, and you can see an error occurred while executing the state, blah, 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 blah. The JSON path $customer ID specified in here cannot be found. And then when I looked at it, like if you click on this guy and you look at the output, obviously it's not outputting the correct object here. So, this just shows you like this stuff can go wrong and it's important to experiment. So let me show you how I fixed this. So very, very simply, go to edit state machine and back to the studio. And if you go here and you go to where's the error handling? Yeah, error handling. And you go to the catcher. So we need to go here. I just added this thing here. So in the result path, you need to select the result. So you need to tell it to give, and you can read it here, use the result path filter to add the error to the original state before sending it as the result output to the fallback state. So that's one thing that I did. And a second thing that I did was that I went into the configuration, and for output, I also added the original inputs to the output using result path. So I did those two things, which seem to resolve this problem. So let's try this again. We're going to go apply and exit. Why can't I? Okay, that's fine. I guess we'll go back. Okay, customer order flow. You can see here I failed a few times, so I was trying to figure out like what was going on here. Let's try this whole exercise again. So let's paste this thing in. So I think that one, right? Okay, let's try order ID 103 this time. So let's go into Dynamo and run. Okay, so there's nothing with order ID 103, right? Just this one entry. So let's click this and move back as quickly as we can. So start execution, go. Go, come on. Order 103. You know what? I was so slow that I wasn't able to do it fast enough. But you can see that it did actually work correctly. So, we did the add order entry, we did the choice. You can see that we had the status code. We called this and it failed, and then we falled back here, and then we ran to an exception. You can see now the output as well, like we captured the entire output. For this step, we captured the entire output. So we have the original input. In addition, we have the output in the result field. So I hope this video was useful in kind of telling you about how step functions work and the kind of stuff you can do with it with Lambda and DynamoDB. If you want to learn more about step functions, I have like an old video on it. I'll put to the left here. And thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.